Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 32. I've sort of run across a number of kind of efforts out there sort of trying to lower the temperature. And so before we sort of jump into a lot of questions, maybe you can tell us, because I discovered Courageous Conversations about our schools. To be honest with you, I don't even exactly remember how it crossed my radar, but when I saw it, it looked like it really fit the bill for that kind of thing. So maybe we can start off by just telling us a little bit about that project and sort of what it's about and why you started it.
Yeah, I as a career-long educator, I became really concerned a few years ago when the culture wars in education sort of erupted, along with culture wars outside of education. But there were claims being made that teachers are indoctrinating students, and we've got to stop that. We've heard about these not only calls for the banning of books in schools, but laws that are being passed locally and in states to remove books that, it's not the first time in our history when this has happened, but it's come up again. Also things like gender and sexual identity has become something right at the epicenter of the culture wars, people being very concerned about what they think teachers are doing in terms of sort of cultivating or grooming kids to think about sexuality and sexual identity and gender identity in ways that they wouldn't have had someone not brought it up. So now you have laws, in Florida, like Don't Say Gay law, which initially, seemed somewhat reasonable on the surface, that you wouldn't be promoting, talking about these ideas too much with K-3 kids. And now it's K-12. And the law is very vague, and it's unclear whether a teacher could even put a picture of themselves on their desk if they were married to someone of the same gender, whether that would be promoting something. So anyway, I created this podcast, David, Courageous Conversations about our schools, because I wanted to see if we could get people with very different perspectives on some of those questions to agree to a few simple conversation agreements, like let the other person talk without interrupting, and really listen to try to understand and have people sort of embrace this idea, at least for the half hour, an hour, of curiosity over confrontation. And it's really about what Peter Coleman talks about, the difference between dialogue and debate. And we're really trying to have dialogue. He says, and Peter is someone from Columbia University who's written a lot about toxic polarization. And he says what we really should be striving for is dialogue these days, and because debate is really about scoring points and winning and trying to get people to believe what you say and think and what you're advocating for. And dialogue is about opening up and trying to get to a solution, or not, at least an understanding. And that means that from time to time we might admit that maybe I didn't get that right, and maybe I need to think about that differently. And that's what I'm trying to do in this new podcast.
That's educator turned podcaster Ken Futernick. For me personally, this is kind of a little hot button topic for me. This is a sort of attack on science and education.
Let me just ask you a question, because you and I are sort of doing the same thing. We're sort of fascinated and concerned about this outrage and the culture wars and all that, and how we can, if there's an entry point into it, to try to make a difference. But Peter Coleman talks about something called the friend problem. And it's a phenomenon he's discovered, that when people like you and myself and Peter and and Amanda Ripley, I mentioned before, anyone who tries to do what you just described and what I'm trying to do in my podcast, goes out and says, Dylan Marin, conversations with people who hate me. Our friends, or the people that are part of our tribe, can be skeptical at the very least, and I think so. There's a tendency, a possibility of feeling like we're being disloyal to our causes by listening to people without calling them out. And I just wonder if you've ever had that happen to you, or if you ever feel that way.
Oh yeah, I mean, I hear that as one of the common feedbacks is you were too easy on that person, or you should have attacked them on this and that, or whatever point. And yeah, so I get that a lot. Even so that's one place where I get it, that yeah, people will say you should have been harder on that person or something, or you should have straightened them out or whatever. So I do hear that. And I think a big piece of it is you look at this trust issue, right? I mean, a lot of the further I get into this different science on this, that we sort of think of it as a post-truth world, but really it's kind of more of a post-trust world. And once you have crossed that barrier where the other person is kind of evil or immoral, there's no room for information transfer, right? There's no room for knowledge transfer, and so you're just going to push back no matter what they say. So that makes it a real challenge if you just come at this from a hard perspective. But yeah, to your point about sort of there's this idea of enforcing the norms, and so if I don't demonstrate my outrage appropriately to my tribe, I'm going to lose points or with them. And I think that's happening with our politicians as well, right? I mean, and it's a negative feedback loop in that we kind of have been convinced that the other side is bad. So if our politicians aren't telling us the other side is bad enough, we want them to do it more, and then they do it more, and then we believe it more, and then we want it more. And so it's a very negative cycle. But it has gotten to that point where, I mean, if you look at our political elites, the politicians and others at that level, they're afraid to say anything that's sort of counter to this hostile narrative towards the other side. And that means that they can't even, like you say, even compromising, which, I think a lot of people don't understand that democracy is basically compromise. I mean, one of the political scientists I spoke with, Kevin Smith, was, telling us that there's this idea of the loser's burden in America, that it's really an important aspect of American democracy, that if we lose, we lost, but we'll get another chance in a little while. It's not life or death. It's not apocalypse if the other side wins. But that's kind of the mode we've got things in, that we think if the other side wins, and we also emotionally, it's very hard, right? We take it so personally if our side loses. And so that loss becomes just an emotional, it's really powerful. It's very hurtful. It really hurts us. We really take it personally.
Yeah, and that's in some of the work I'm doing locally in the county in which I live in Northern California, to bridge our divides. We have this initiative. I think there are people who think this is about eliminating conflict and somehow putting it aside. And I frequently try to remind my residents in this county, as we do this work and do bridge building workshops and things, it's not about no conflict, it's about healthy conflict. And Amanda Ripley talks a lot about that in her book. Monica Guzman's book, I Never Thought of It That Way. She's a senior fellow at the Braver Angels, an organization, one of the 8,000 that you mentioned. And she's also a journalist. She also talks about the importance of healthy conflict, but it's in a democracy. But in our relationships with our partners and our organizations and schools, helping people have healthy conflict is so important. It's so important in a democracy. I remember Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, and Abraham Lincoln surrounded himself with his political opponents in his cabinet because he wanted to get their ideas on the table. and we have to do that, but the caveat is that there is a hard, a sort of a red line where we have to remind ourselves that we are what we have in common, that we're committed to democracy. We have to be civil, we have to be respectful, we have to empathize with each other. And when we cross that red line, terrible things happen, because then the conflicts become high conflict. We stop learning from each other, and our own thinking becomes impaired. Our thinking about the problem, because we don't have the benefit of really truly understanding, excuse me, the problem from other people's perspectives, and then we just dig our heels in and start making assumptions that are often wrong about the problem and about the other people on the other side.
Right. And that's from, it seems like from a lot of the research on this is that one of the most effective things you can do is lower that perception gap somewhat, right? And get people to see that, yeah, there are people on the other side that probably are crossing some red line that you have, but not everybody. And they're not all like that. And there's much more, you can probably agree on, there's much more, they're not as extreme as you think they are. And this kind of thing. And that seems to be more effective than things like fact checking and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I would say this too, that this going back to this idea that people talk about that I've been trying to do, and now I do with some in-person workshops, and I do it on my podcast, is just promote this idea of listening. And I've asked some of my guests to do something that Amanda Ripley calls looping. It will be familiar to your listeners. It just goes by a different name, sometimes paraphrasing, but sometimes I'll ask political opposites or people on different sides of an issue. Like in one case, I had a conservative state senator from Kentucky on a call about civics education and what teachers ought to be focusing on there. And I also had a couple of liberal social studies teachers that teach high school civics. But when each of them responded to a question I had about what should civics teachers really talk about, and are there things they should avoid talking about, I asked the senator to see if he could just loop back and say what he thought the liberal social studies teacher from Austin, Texas had said. And she said, you got it right. And you, not only that, you added something to it that I really like. And when she did the same to him, his response was, you said it better than I did. And then the conversation went in an unexpected direction. They basically said, I don't really understand where we disagree. And where I thought the disagreement lay is in this idea, do we talk to our students and help them understand where there are injustices in our society and about the dark parts of our history? And this senator had supported a bill that at one point before it got modified was really sort of limiting what teachers could talk about in Kentucky and avoiding topics that would make students uncomfortable. But that got changed due to some pressure from students and others, educators. But in listening to and having a teacher really listen to him carefully enough to repeat back what she thought he was saying, he became very generous in wanting to know what she said, and then basically saying, I think I agree with pretty much everything you said. And so, being a podcast host and hearing that, and just as an educator who's concerned about the culture wars, it makes me feel a greater sense of hope that these divides can be bridged, that we can depolarize. And it starts with listening, it starts with being empathetic, but the interesting paradox is that it seems like we're perhaps giving oxygen to really bad ideas sometimes. But in fact, the ideas aren't always as bad, or the particular ideas that someone has aren't as bad as we thought they might have been. It's not that there aren't really bad ideas being promoted out there, but sometimes the people that we assume embrace those ideas actually don't, or it's some different version of it, or if they do, if we listen to them, they're willing to think about it, and if that happens, and if we're willing to do the same, it gives me a sense of hope about our future of our school systems and our country.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. Yeah, I mean, I think oftentimes people get caught up in sort of the shallow sort of trigger words or capture words or whatever people use to describe these things, and we don't really necessarily know what that means. And as you say, as you maybe drill down on, well, what specific policy does that mean? You know, we might find a lot less conflict on some of the specific. There might be a few that, like, yeah, okay, that policy, it's kind of a hard time agreeing about that, but there may be many actual specific policies that we have a much more agreement on than we think we do. And I think this is true with things like immigration. I think this is true with things like gun control. I even think it's true with, issues like abortion, right? I think there probably are a number of policy issues there's more agreement on than people think there are. And there's definitely some red lines that people don't want to cross. But people get stuck in sort of the high level words that people use in the politically elite arena, and we kind of fall. Well, I can't support that. That's the bad word thing. I can't support that or whatever. And so you think all the rest of it comes with it or whatever.
Yeah, and book banning is a good example of that, because I had people on one of our episodes sort of roughly for and against book banning, but I had to point out to the people that said they were opposed to book banning. I said I can't imagine any of us could really be against book banning. He said we wouldn't want books on bond making in an elementary school library, or books that are just blatantly pornographic, right? And they said, well, that's true. I said, well, so it's not that all books, all materials should be available. It's where do we draw the line? But then we ran into some real differences of opinion, like there are a lot of books that are being removed from school libraries, banned, that simply because they have LGBTQ authors or themes. Now there's a healthy conflict we ought to be having, because why should we be doing that? And then let's talk about that. But this whole idea of we're against book banning or for book banning, or this idea of immigration is, it boils down to, do we want a wall or not? And it's so much more complicated.
Right.
And if we get into the complexity of book banning or immigration or parent rights when it comes to school, which is another one, then people pause oftentimes and say, let me think about that. Or they're willing to, if you say, I want to think about that. It says we'll be a little bit vulnerable. I don't know if I have the answer to that question. I need to think about it. And that's if people are saying that, and you're in a healthier place.
Yeah, and people try to legislate some of these ideas, that haven't really been well crafted, and these kind of high level things that are complex like that. And often, and that legislation is usually basically a disaster because it's so vague. You can sort of make it be anything or nothing, depending on how you sort of decide to interpret it.
Yeah. You asked me earlier about, things that I've learned in doing this work. And I was just thinking about something you just said about, fact checking and so forth. And a couple of things come to mind. One is that Amanda Ripley, I think it was, who said relationships far more than facts are the things that are likely to get people to at least question and be open to a different way of thinking. And I have to say, in most of my career, I studied philosophy and was a philosopher of education. And the people that I spoke to in that group, we often had, a really intense dialogue, and we welcomed people pointing out something that may be a flaw in your reasoning about something. But I had this idea as an educator that we want kids to learn how to think and how to think critically and to use logic and evidence and facts appropriately. And I still think that, of course. But what I realized is that that's not enough. If you're trying to get people to open up to thinking about something differently, whether you're a teacher trying to do that with students or your student trying to do that with your teacher or other students, or that what matters is in an exchange and a dialogue is whether people trust you to begin with. And if you don't feel trusted, if you don't trust the other person, then how often you've been in a situation like that, someone says, did you know, and cites a fact, and you go, oh, I didn't realize that. You're right. And I'm going to change we don't frequently change because of someone pointing out the illogic of an argument or a new fact. We do sometimes and are willing to be open to a different way of thinking and a new fact or a fact that maybe replaces a bad assumption or a bad belief we have, if the people or the source of that information is from a trusted person or trusted source. And because then we can be vulnerable enough to say, I thought this, and then you pointed this out, and I'm willing to think about it. But we're only willing to do that if we can be vulnerable with the other person, and they're not going to shame you and say, I can't believe that you were such an idiot to have believed that before. There's this guy whose name I forget. He's been cited a lot, black man in South Carolina that met with, he would meet with KKK members and have coffee with them.
Yeah, I know you're talking about. I can't remember his name right now either.
Yeah.
That man is Daryl Davis, a black man who spent 30 years befriending members of the Ku Klux Klan. He says 200 Klansmen have given up their robes after talking with him.
I thought he was pulling my leg. As I was laughing, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, flipped through his credit cards and pictures, and produced his Klan card and handed it to me. And immediately I stopped laughing. I recognized the logo on there, the Klan symbol, and now I'm wondering, why am I sitting with a Klansman? But he was very friendly. It was the music, that brought us together. The fact that a Klansman and a black person could sit down at the same table, enjoy the same music, that was a seed planted. So what do you do when you plant a seed? You nourish it. And that was the impetus for me to write a book. And I decided to go around the country and sit down with Klan leaders and Klan members to find out, how can you hate me when you don't even know me?
But he would develop this relationship over days or weeks. And something like over 200 documented cases of people who left the KKK because of the dialogue and the relationship they established with a black man. And I think it just demonstrates, if you want to persuade, which isn't always the goal, I think we have to realize part of it is just to understand. But if there's some potential for persuasion and you're open to the idea that you might be persuaded by them, it's got to happen through empathy and relationships.
Right. Well, I mean, I really want to thank you again for coming on the show. And I know we've run a little long, but I've enjoyed it a lot.
I have too. As you said at the outset, maybe before we recorded, the hope was for us to have a coffee shop conversation, and I appreciated the fact that it was unscripted and we got to meander around and covered different aspects of this problem. And it's I hope it's interesting and thought-provoking for your listeners.
Yeah, I think it will be, and I wish you luck with your project, and I want to stay in touch and stay kind of up to date about how it's going.
Let's do that. Let's plan to be in touch in a few months or a year and see what progress has been made, and see if any of this is making a difference.
That'd be great, and I definitely hope that it is. I mean, we're all doing our part, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Ken. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, sure thing. And good luck. Yeah, take care.
You too. Bye-bye. That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Our focus for 2024 is to make the best show possible, to add the most value to you, our listeners. And the best way we can keep improving on that is to hear from you. What do you like to see? What do you want to see? What would make this show more valuable for you? You can give us that feedback at outrageoverload@gmail.com. Or if you're worried about hurting my feelings, you can go directly to outrageoverload.net/survey and give those comments anonymously. So thanks again for listening, and look for a new episode in a couple of weeks.